The darkest pastor in Western Virginia didn't just preach in his church, he forced 3 of his own nieces to become his wives beneath its rotting rafters. Deep in the lonely ridges of the Appalachian spine, in a forgotten corner of McDowell County, whispers still circulate about a story as revealing as it is grotesque, an account shaped by crushing isolation and generations of consanguineous bonds woven into one family's blood. This is the tale of Ezekiel Thornton, a self-ordained preacher who wrapped himself in scripture while orchestrating one of the most shocking documented incest arrangements of the mid-20th century. His saga remained buried for decades behind the natural fortress of mountains and the suffocating silence that rural post-war communities held like a second religion. Not until 1978, after anxious neighbors dared to voice their concerns, did the first real crack form in the facade, allowing the truth to seep out. Ezekiel had entered the world in 1911, born on a modest plot far from Welsh, the county's only bustling town. Raised by mining parents, he grew up among families already accustomed to isolation, and to marriages that kept bloodlines as tight as ridge-locked valleys. Census notes confirm that his parents, Isaac and Martha, were second cousins, a practice rarely questioned in those remote slopes. At 19, Ezekiel labored briefly in the coal mines until pneumonia gripped him underground. The fever nearly ended his life, but when it broke, something else broke with it. Elderly locals later recalled the shift. The once quiet minehand emerged from the sickness aflame with a strange, consuming sense of divine appointment. He claimed God had chosen him to build a new faith, one he christened the Church of Purified Redemption. By 1935, the church stood, a small wooden cabin hammered together on Thornton soil. At first, only nearby kin and a handful of curious neighbors attended the odd gatherings. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, Ezekiel shaped his doctrine to suit himself. He spoke of purifying the blood, of protecting a chosen lineage, of keeping families whole in spirit and in flesh. Thomas Jenkins, one of the early attendees who quickly withdrew, later recalled, he said God revealed that families should remain one, body and blood. He spoke like he was chosen to preserve his own line. Through the 1940s and into the 1950s, Thornton's homestead faded into deeper seclusion. A tall fence appeared, discouraging contact with the outside world. It was during these years that Ezekiel assumed total control over the lives of his 3 nieces, the daughters of his younger sister, Rebecca. Rebecca died in 1947 from childbirth complications, the newborn dying with her. Orphaned, the girls, Mary, 1932, Sarah, 1934, and Ruth, 1936, fell completely under Ezekiel's grasp. He became their guardian, their teacher, their pastor, dictating every corner of their existence. School records show none of the 3 girls ever returned to public classes after their mother's death. Ezekiel assured the rare visiting official that he was homeschooling them through scripture, though what he truly taught them would only be understood decades later. The horror began to take its shape when Mary turned 18 in 1950. In a ceremony Ezekiel described as a sacred union commanded by the Lord, he forced the eldest niece to marry him. The event was held inside the tiny wooden chapel, the only witnesses being family members too controlled or too terrified to intervene. Before I continue, take a moment to subscribe if you value stories that expose the darkest realities buried in America's hills, tales of isolation, secrecy, and the devastation that follows. Our investigations bring to light the cases history tried to erase. 2 years later, in 1952, he performed a second ritual, this time binding himself to Sarah, also at 18. By 1954, the pattern completed its grotesque cycle when Ruth, the youngest, was forced into her own marriage to her uncle. None of these ceremonies ever touched the county records. Ezekiel kept a handwritten ledger he called the Sacred Book of Unions, documenting only his own rituals, no witnesses, no legal presence, just his word carved into paper. One of the earliest people to sense that something was terribly wrong was Amelia Carton, a nurse at Welsh Small Hospital in the 1950s and 60s. She occasionally treated the girls, always escorted by Ezekiel. They were painfully timid, she later testified. They wouldn't look you in the eye. They looked starved and frightened. But in those days, interfering in the affairs of remote families was nearly impossible. The consequences of the unions appeared quickly. Between 1951 and 1978, 12 children were born from Ezekiel's marriages to his nieces. 5 died before the age of 5, suffering from severe congenital deformities. Those who survived bore visible and invisible scars, developmental delays, organ defects, and a lifetime of inherited genetic consequences. Dr. William Harrison, a geneticist who later examined the case, wrote in 1980, "This was not a single instance of incest. This was generations of closely related marriages culminating in uncle-niece unions among individuals already sharing amplified genetic material." James, the first child born to Mary in 1951, suffered from extreme polydactyly, extra fingers and toes, and severe cognitive impairment. He never developed functional speech, even as an adult. Life under Ezekiel followed strict, punishing routines. The 3 women and their children lived in near-biblical poverty, tending a small plot that barely fed them. The children never attended school, never received vaccinations, rarely stepped beyond the fenced boundary. Ezekiel told them the outside world was unclean, that only their bloodline was chosen to remain pure. Daily life revolved around forced prayers, rigid rules, and brutal punishments for anyone who questioned him. For nearly 30 years, the Thornton property remained sealed off, shielded by geography, fear, and a culture reluctant to interfere in family matters. The sealed world Ezekiel had built might have lasted another generation, if not for one boy willing to emerge from the shadows. In 1978, the first breach in the Thornton fortress occurred when Daniel, born to Sarah in 1962, managed what none of the others had ever dared. He escaped. 16 years old, underdeveloped, and terrified, Daniel walked nearly 20 kilometers through the rugged mountains until the lights of Welsh finally came into view. Despite his learning difficulties and halting speech, he conveyed enough to the authorities for them to understand something monstrous was happening on that remote patch of land. Sheriff Robert Anderson, who led the first official visit that October, later described the moment they arrived. "It was like stepping a century backward. Everything on that property felt frozen in time and in suffering. The structures were collapsing. The air smelled of rot. Children with visible deformities peered from behind warped door frames, gaunt, silent, trembling. Ezekiel, at 67, still ruled over the scene like a prophet presiding over a crumbling kingdom, wielding a mix of religious fervor and fear to maintain obedience. The authorities found themselves facing a legal labyrinth. In 1978, West Virginia had no laws tailored to deal with incestuous religious marriages, especially ones never formally recorded. The ceremonies existed only inside Ezekiel's handwritten ledger, no licenses, no witnesses, nothing the state could classify cleanly. But child neglect, deprivation, and hazardous living conditions were impossible to ignore. McDowell County Social Services quickly secured a court order, and 7 surviving children, ranging from 3 to 16, were removed from the property. Then came the far quieter tragedy, the condition of the 3 women. Mary, Sarah, and Ruth appeared like ghosts of themselves, bodies thin, eyes hollow, minds conditioned by decades of manipulation. Dr. Lenham Montgomery, the psychologist assigned to their care, wrote, "We saw pronounced signs of psychological captivity, emotional dependence on their abuser, an inability to identify the abuse itself, an intense fear of separation from him. This is classic long-term indoctrination layered with trauma." The sisters resisted at first, begging to return to Ezekiel. They believed they had fulfilled a divine destiny because he had taught them nothing else. Montgomery noted that therapy required starting at the very foundations of identity. We had to teach them how to make choices, how to see themselves as individuals. Even simple tasks, shopping, speaking on their own, using a phone, were unfamiliar after so many years under control. Meanwhile, deep medical examinations revealed the biological cost paid by the children. Dr. Robert Collins, a pediatrician evaluating the 7 minors, documented abnormalities that went far beyond what was immediately visible. Yes, there were deformities, misshapen limbs, fused fingers, heart defects, but beneath the surface lay weakened immune systems, neurological delays, and predispositions to seizures. Geneticists soon realized what they were looking at, one of the highest documented consanguinity coefficients in American medical history. Dr. Harrison's later study estimated the children carried a 20 to 25% genetic overlap, a staggering value considering even first-cousin marriages average around 6%. What the Thorntons carried wasn't just the legacy of one incestuous union, it was the compounded result of multiple generations of inbreeding, culminating in uncle-niece relationships involving individuals who already shared amplified genetic material. Harrison would later say, "This case was the manifestation of everything hidden in their lineage. Deleterious genes that would normally remain dormant were forced into expression." As legal procedures advanced, the community and authorities realized the case represented something far larger than one man's delusion. It exposed how isolation, geographic, cultural, and religious, can mutate into something catastrophic when left unchallenged. Ezekiel's trial began in March 1979, drawing regional attention despite local efforts to shield the victims' identities. Throughout the proceedings, Ezekiel remained disturbingly unwavering. He spoke with the certainty of a man who believed he had lived righteously. At one chilling moment, he declared, "They call it sin. I call it sacred. They call it disease. I call it the mark of the chosen." Experts diagnosed him with a severe delusional disorder laced with narcissistic traits, yet fully capable of understanding the consequences of his actions. Dr. Calvin Matthews, the forensic psychiatrist who assessed him, concluded, "His belief system was not insanity, it was a crafted theology designed to justify his desires. He knew what he was doing." In June 1979, the verdict came. Ezekiel Thornton was convicted on multiple counts, including child neglect, forced isolation, and exploitation of vulnerable dependents. Though the incest charges were complicated by lack of legal documentation, the weight of medical evidence and testimony secured a 25-year sentence. He never served the full term. Ezekiel died in prison in 1984, at age 73, never admitting wrongdoing, never expressing regret. But the wreckage he left behind stretched far beyond his death. Mary, Sarah, and Ruth entered long-term rehabilitation, living together at a center devoted to survivors of prolonged abuse. Their progress was slow but significant. Ruth, the youngest, adapted most quickly. At 47, she completed a basic education through a special program. Mary and Sarah made smaller strides, burdened by deeper psychological scars from their longer years under Ezekiel's control. The children faced even steeper battles. Their conditions required ongoing medical supervision. Many struggled with severe cognitive delays. James, the eldest, lived his adult life in a care institution, unable to live independently. But among them, Daniel, the boy who escaped, became the quiet emblem of resistance. Despite chronic heart problems and developmental challenges, he learned to navigate the outside world as best he could. In a rare interview at age 25, he said, "I don't always understand life out here, but I know it's better than what we had. Sometimes I dream of that place, of voices saying we were chosen, when we were really being destroyed." The deeper one looks into those forgotten rural enclaves, the more the stories begin to bleed together, names shift, dates blur, but the patterns remain disturbingly familiar. Every holler had its own whispered warnings, but none carried the same weight as the tale of the family whose isolation became a cage they willingly stepped into. People in the neighboring towns never spoke of them directly. They'd refer to them sideways, using phrases like "that ridge folk" or "the old line up past the creek." Nobody wanted to say their name aloud, as if doing so might summon the rot that clung to that lineage. But in the records, what little survived through fragmented county ledgers and brittle church logs, the surname appeared again and again, tied to births with no fathers listed, marriages that raised too many questions, and disappearances that were never properly investigated. What stood out most was how drastically the family changed across each generation. Photos from the late 1800s showed stern-faced mountain farmers, sun-baked and gaunt from work, but otherwise ordinary people. By the 1920s, the faces looked different, eyes set too close, jawlines sloping, expressions vacant. Locals used to say it wasn't poverty that reshaped them, nor the hardships of rural life. It was something else entirely. Something chosen. There was one account written by a traveling school teacher who briefly attempted to run a small class in the region. In her faded journal, she noted how children from that family sat silently, never speaking unless forced, their pupils widening unnaturally when the lantern light flickered. She observed bruises that no one explained and a strange, feverish stillness that hung over them, as if they were listening to something no one else could hear. She only lasted 2 weeks before abandoning the job, claiming she felt watched even when the room was empty. And then there was the matter of the house, the central structure on the ridge, built long before the Civil War, its foundation sinking into the soil like a tomb refusing to rest. Unlike other mountain homes, which expanded over time with patched lumber and mismatched additions, this one remained eerily unchanged. Every beam, every window frame, every warp board looked exactly as it had been a century earlier. Locals insisted the family never renovated because the original structure was part of the agreement, though no one could say what that agreement was or who it was with. What they did know was that outsiders were never welcome. Not sheriffs, not census workers, not preachers. Anyone who approached uninvited was met with silence, curtains drawn, footsteps scurrying behind walls, and once, according to an old deputy's testimony, a warning shot fired from somewhere deep within the trees. It wasn't open hostility. It was something colder. Something territorial. The turning point came during the winter of 1949, a season remembered for its brutal storms and the strange sickness that swept through several mountain communities. While neighboring families sought help or traveled to towns for medicine, the Ridge House remained sealed. Smoke rose from its chimney day and night, but no one came or went. When spring thawed the roads and the first search party ventured up, what they found inside was described as unnatural, though the official reports used vague terms like severe neglect and unfit conditions. A dozen family members, all pale and hollow, were discovered living in a silence so complete it disturbed even the most hardened officers. They spoke in fragments, half-sentences, clipped whispers, never addressing one another directly, as though communicating through means unseen. Medical examiners later noted anomalies in their bone structures and hearing responses but attributed them to genetic isolation. Privately, however, a few of them admitted they had never encountered anything quite like it. Yet the strangest part wasn't who was found, it was who wasn't. Several members listed in church records, particularly adult men, were absent. No graves were located. No belongings hinted at their fate. The family simply insisted they had gone back into the ridge, a phrase that meant nothing to authorities but seemed perfectly clear to the survivors. Whenever questioned, they repeated the same chilling line, "The mountain takes back what belongs to it." Over the following decades, the family's numbers dwindled. Those who remained alive rarely traveled beyond the foot of the ridge. A few tried to leave entirely, boarding buses or hitching rides to nearby towns, but witnesses claimed they always returned within days, walking barefoot along the shoulder of the road, clothes torn, eyes vacant. When asked why they came back, each gave the same answer in the same monotone voice. "It wouldn't let me go." Even now, remnants of that lineage continue to live in the abandoned bends of the mountain, though no official census has acknowledged them in years. Hunters occasionally spot figures moving through the fog at dusk, shadows with familiar features but uncanny gait, disappearing the moment they're noticed. And just like that, the story, once dismissed as backwoods folklore, becomes something much harder to ignore. Because the deeper you dig, the clearer it becomes, some bloodlines don't fade naturally. They cling. They endure. And sometimes, they transform into something the outside world was never meant to understand.